Commemorative Air Force Warbird Tube webinar for this evening. I'm your host, Steve Buss, and we're certainly glad you could join us tonight. This webinar series is made possible through the Commemorative Air Force, and you can support CAF through membership or donations. For more information on how you can support the mission of CAF to educate, inspire, and honor, please visit our website, commemorativeairforce.org. Tonight, we're going to take a trip back in time and look back at another part of the history of the Confederate, now commemorative Air Force with Brad Pilgrim. And as Brad and I go through our slides and we talk about some of the history from about the mid-60s to the early 70s, this is when CAF started to build up the fleet. Most of the fighters were already online, and we'll see some of the heavier iron come in. And if you've got any questions, just type them in the chat box. We'll try to answer them either during the presentation, or we'll save time at the end to answer those questions as well. So with that, let me welcome back to Warbird Tube webinar, Brad Pilgrim. Brad, great to see you and great to have you back tonight.
Thank you, Steve. It's good to be here.
Good.
Sorry I couldn't find somebody more qualified.
Well, we're gonna start out with I guess a little somber news. Those who may have been to shows in Harlingen and CAF shows throughout the years probably remember Colonel Eddie May, known as the Mouth of the South. He was the chief announcer for all the air shows for CAF, and I never had the opportunity to meet him, but Brad, I know you did. Tell us a little bit about him and his recent passing.
Well, Eddie was a very successful insurance salesman down in the Valley, and a successful guy, and had been in the Army Air Corps during the war. I don't think he flew. I can't remember exactly what he did, but he was a military guy, and he joined the CAF in 1966, as far as I can tell, and ended up a life member. And you'd be very hard to find somebody more dedicated in the early Harlingen days than Eddie May was. He did all the air show announcing, or at least the majority of the air show announcing. He's kind of the guy who got Tennessee Ernie Ford to come up on the stand the first time and help him. He did all the, like when they used to do Wing Staff Conference and all the award ceremonies and all that. Eddie May was the MC for all that stuff. He was just one of those people that if you think back to the Harlingen air shows and you think of the narration that you heard, that was him that you were listening to. And if you're like me and we're a little kid, I can still hear all that in my mind, and I listen to old videos of it and stuff. And he just had a very good presence and was well known all over the country, but as the Mouth of the South, like you said. And he was a very nice guy and a Hall of Fame member and very dedicated to the CF. And sadly, he died this last week, right before the 4th. And it's a big loss to the CAF, and there's not a whole lot of the real early guys left anymore. Eddie, I think, was about 90 or something like that. So just shows you how time marches on, and enjoy people while you have the opportunity.
That is very true, and I guess something that a lot of folks may not know, but they've probably seen these pictures before, is that Eddie had kind of an alter ego that you'd see in some of the publications.
Yeah, he was Colonel Haphazard was his name. And he was back when the CF there was things were a lot more humor based, I guess, back in the old days. And he was used in a lot of the safety articles and stuff like that. They would have pictures like this one, and I think there's another one of him doing ridiculous things. That's Connie Edwards, A26, coming straight at him and stuff like that. And there were several of these pictures that were in the early days in the old dispatches when they were still just stapled sheets of paper mailed out. There was a lot of pictures like this, but that's a lot of people don't realize that's Eddie May, but it actually is. That's him. So that was his alter ego. He just the kind of guy he was.
Well, as I alluded to in the introduction, the mid to late 60s is when some of the heavy iron started coming online for the CAF. One of the big ones, of course, is Diamond Lil, the B-24A.
Yeah, Diamond Lil, she's actually out on tour right now for the first time in a couple of years. They just got her back out, got new landing gear trunnions put in and everything. It was a major job, and can't say enough about the volunteers and the maintenance staff who got that done. And she's out on the road doing well. It was a bomber converted to a transport, long roundabout story, and is now back semi-bomber configuration. The company consolidated, used her as a transport during the war, and this is late in the war when it would have still had the long nose added to it and was bare metal. There's other pictures of it here when it still had the short nose, was camouflage. This is right, or gray and green. This is right after it was converted to a transport. That's a consolidated employee in front of it that I can't identify. But the airplane, went through various jobs with Consolidated. And then it was the first airplane, first B-24, that was actually marketed as a executive transport after the war. And what they did was, this is it during the war, right at the very end of the war. What they did was they used this airplane to do the type certificate work and everything. And so if you get a type rating in the B-24 today, an actual type rating that says CV LB30 on there, which means Consolidated Vultee LB30. The reason is Diamond Lil, the original serial number when it was in British was AM927, which you see on the tail fin there. And no one cared about Warbirds back then, so they never went back to the original American serial number. So it kept AM927, which is an LB30 number. So you get a type rating today, it doesn't say B-24, it says LB30 because this is the airplane that they used to establish the standards. But anyway, the airplane went through Continental Can and a couple of other civilian owners, and was very plush on the inside and all that, and it wound up down in Mexico. And this is when it was in Continental Can colors. The Pemex, Petróleos Mexicanos, the Mexican National Petroleum Company, they used it for their executive transport. It was also used at the same time as basically Air Force One for the Mexican president. And John Agather, who a lot of people in the CAF know, he's the son, one of the sons of Vic and Fifi Agather. John Agather will tell you that he had his very first alcoholic drink in this airplane when he was much younger, flying in it down in Mexico. But anyway, this is when it first got to Mexico and it has a Mexican registration. And then it wound up painted in much more colorful, I guess you could say, with these markings here. And this is right after it came back to the Texas from Mexico. You can see all the national flags on the front of it, all the places that it went. We got the airplane in 1967. The airplane was ferried up to Brownwood. These are original engine cow flaps that we have. I pulled these out of the container a couple of years ago and polished them up. So you can see how shiny it was. It was really quite pimped out for, an old World War II bomber. But the airplane was a fancy transport. And the Mexicans traded basically some money and a DC-4 for this B-24. The B-24 arrived. They wanted the engines off of it back to put it on some C-47s they have. CAF didn't want to get rid of the engines, and there's a long drawn out, not a battle, but a lot of withholding information, I guess you'd say. And they managed to keep the engines, but the Mexicans wouldn't give them the paperwork for the airplane. So it sat in Brownwood, Texas at the bomber base at the time from 1967 until 1968, when they finally paid for the engines and sent 2 engines down there that they bought at another sale. They never took the engines off Diamond Lil. They literally went down to Brownsville, Texas, met at the bridge, and literally they handed them the paperwork for the engines. The Mexicans handed the CF the paperwork for the airplane. It went over to General Dynamics at Fort Worth. They did the certification and all that. In 1968, we started flying it. So you'll see paperwork-wise, it'll say we bought the airplane in 67, which is true. We didn't operate it till 68 because we couldn't afford to pay for the engines.
There are some very interesting stories, not only with Diamond Lil, but some of the other aircraft, not only CA aircraft, but also in the Warbird movement in the 60s, as they were becoming surplus from some South American countries and things. So it's an interesting and colorful history of Warbirds. It certainly is, and Diamond Lil is just a part of that.
Well, we had 2 A26s in the CF. We didn't get them until the early 70s. We had 2 A26s that were later sold to somebody else because they both were later executive conversions and were not as nice. And both of those wound up drug runners. One of them crashed under mysterious circumstances in Florida, and the other one mysteriously burned up in a hangar because the guy owed some money to a cartel somewhere. So even after they became Warbirds, a lot of them got pressed back into other service. It was interesting, as you see.
You mentioned the engines on the B-24. Those were the original engines that came off the factory line from Consolidated?
They're the same kind, a little bit different model, a little bit later model. These are the 1830s that are on there now and have been all these years, basically are the same as the C-47 has. So it's just a little later version of it.
And for those who don't know, if we go back to the very early history of Diamond Lil, she was originally supposed to go to England, but had a little landing gear mishap and ended up getting bent up a little bit. And in those days, they just went to the next airplane and left what would become Diamond Lil, did some repairs, and as you said, they used it as a transport across the southeast or southwest throughout the war. So after the glass nose was damaged, they put that solid nose on there, and the rest is history, I guess.
When it arrived in Texas, it had leather, it had carpet, it had weather radar, it was the only airplane in the CAF fleet that had radios at one point. And shortly after it arrived, they took all the radios out and started putting them into the fighters because none of the single seat fighters had radios in. So Diamond Lil really at the time was the nicest airplane the CAF had. It was back then. The joke, as I've said before, the joke was you didn't know if you needed to be wearing a flight suit or a dinner jacket to get in the airplane because it was so nice. There it is. I think that picture was taken in Fort Worth. I like those colors. I thought it looked good back then. I like that. That's right after we got it flying. You can see we pretty much left it like it was and then wrote Confederate Air Force down the side of the fuselage so that everybody knew it was ours, and put an N number on it. And that's how it flew till 1972 when they finally put a military paint job on it.
And we'll talk a little bit about paint schemes in the CAF a little later in the presentation when we get to our red, white, and blue section. But let's also talk about how the CAF and some of our aircraft were movie stars.
Yeah, the Battle of Britain movie. In 1966, the CAF actually bought 4 of the Messerschmitts that the Spanish Air Force had retired and had up for sale. I think there was 32 of them for sale. And I've got a telegram that was sent to the CAF down in Mercedes in 1966, early 66, like February or March, announcing these 30 some odd airplanes and all these Heinkels and all these Ju-52s were all for sale if they were interested. Connie Edwards, who was a CAF member at the time, Connie went to England on vacation. He called it vacation. Truthfully, it was probably contract work he did back then. And he went over and looked at them and said, yeah, they're good airplanes and everything. Well, then they also found a Spitfire that was for sale in the UK. So the CF bought these 4 Messerschmitts and this Spitfire. A guy named Hamish Mahadi, who was going around trying to gather up airplanes in 66 for the Battle of Britain movie, he found out that the CF had bought these. And so he called the CF or wrote them a letter or whatever and started talking to them about how they needed to use their Messerschmitts and the CF Spitfire if it hadn't left the UK yet for this movie. So the CF, the movie, it got delayed and delayed and delayed and didn't actually happen until 1968 when the filming started. That's Connie Edwards standing in the center right there, and Hamish Mahadi on the right. I'm not sure who that is on the left. I think he's a mechanic, but Hamish there on the right was the guy who was doing all the organizing, finding the airplanes. So the CF, what they did was they said, well, we'll loan you our 5 airplanes. But part of the deal is, we're going to get paid for it and all this, but also our pilots have to fly our airplanes. And that's how the CF actually got involved with flying in the movie. That's 4 of the Messerschmitts flying right there. And nearly all of these still survive today because Connie Edwards, after the movie was over, bought or was given a lot of them in lieu of pay. And they sat in his hangar down in Big Spring, as a lot of people know. And after several years later, Connie sold them all, and he passed away here 3 years ago now. Most of these airplanes are back flying, or a good number of them are back flying today. But the CAF, it was Lefty Gardner, Lloyd Nolan, Gerald Martin, Connie Edwards, and a Canadian guy named Milton Hardens, who was essentially he was a lawyer, but he was kind of like the Canadian Attorney General, and he was the guy who was the CS lawyer, so to speak. So those 5 guys were the 5 that did most of the CF involvement in this movie. Milton, he didn't do a whole lot. I don't know if it was work related or what, but he only did a little flying. But there on the left, that's Robert Sanford Tuck, who's a British ace, and then that's Adolf Galland standing there shaking hands. Obviously, German ace from World War II, big in the Battle of Britain. That's Lloyd Nolan, and then Lefty Gardner, and then I think the 3rd black cowboy hat there, or 2nd black cowboy hat, I think that's Connie Edwards. But that's when they met Adolf Galland for the first time. And he was one of the German technical advisor for the movie and everything like that. And they all got along great. And for years, Galan came to Midland and well, I don't know if he came to Midland. He came to Harlingen many times over the years for the air show. Joined the CAF and everything else, and was part of the fun back then. That's Lloyd and Robert Sanford Tuck, Gerald Martin, and then Adolf Galland, and then Lefty Gardner. And you see the Heinkels and a Messerschmitt sitting there in the back. That picture was taken at Duxford, England in 1968.
And one of the other thing to note there, especially for our younger viewers, is in the center you can see who's the colonel in the middle of the picture.
That's Gerald Martin.
Gerald,
from Hereford,
yeah, Gerald
Texas.
Martin. He's got a Kodak Instamatic camera in his hand.
Yes, he does.
That was high
Martin,
tech back in the 60s.
Gerald Martin, he passed away several years ago, unfortunately. Really neat guy. Gerald did the original Wildcat routine in the aerobatic routine with the Wildcat when the CF first got it. Gerald was a crop duster and an absolute unbelievably gifted pilot. But he was an unbelievable guitar player and singer as well. And one of the things that they did there in Spain while doing some of the filming, when the weather was bad, they had several weeks that they couldn't do anything. They would get there in the Oscars Club, and Gerald Martin, the Spanish, they play flamenco guitar and fancy guitar. Gerald Martin was a flat picker. He played country and western and old cowboy songs, and he would get the guitar down every night there at the club and would sit there and sing old Marty Robbins tune and old cowboy music and all that. Then he could do Moon River and all these other things that Frank Sinatra sang later on. And they say that he nearly single-handedly won over the Spanish Air Force because he was just such an entertainer. And one of the things that I have in my collection is a tape of him and a bunch of other CF people, Randy Sohn and several others, in a hotel room in 1966 or 67, where Gerald's playing his guitar. Him and Tom Short are playing the guitars, and they're singing songs, just country and western songs. And it's really funny to know that guy's this really famous air show pilot that everybody knows. But that's who Gerald Martin was. He wasn't just a pilot. He was a well-known guitar picker. This picture here, this is from 1969. That is a man named Ed Juris standing there on the left, and then Lloyd Nolan on the right. Those are P-47s sitting behind them that came in from Peru in 1969. Ed Juris was a B-17, I think he was a waist gunner, who got shot down during the war, bailed out, escaped, managed to evade, got back. He became a very well-known and very successful antique automobile dealer. He had a company called the Vintage Auto Company up in Nyack, New York. And then he started a company called the Vintage Aircraft Company. And he started going around the world buying up every old airplane he could find, because as he would go, he didn't collect like 57 Chevys and stuff. He collected like Rolls Royces, Duesenbergs, Stutz Bearcats, things like that, $1 million cars now. He would find these airplanes in various hangars where these cars were stored, and he started buying them too. And he was a pilot and flew a lot. Well, he ended up buying, P-38, 2 or 3 P-40s. Him and a guy named Dave Talashay bought the entire fleet of Sea Furies that the Iraqi Air Force owned in 1972. The vast majority of the surviving Sea Furies today are because of Ed Juris and Dave Talashay buying them from Iraq. He bought a Mosquito that we'll see later that came across the ocean. But he bought these 6 P-47s that we'll talk about here in a minute. And he was big in the CAF. And I think he died like in 98 or 99 or something like that. But he's one of those unsung heroes that the Warbird world owes a whole lot, because he recovered a whole lot of airplanes that would have otherwise never been seen again. They'd have disappeared into the scrap pile. So Ed Juris is one of those unknown famous people in the CAF.
Well, along with the Messerschmitts, there was also a CAF Spitfire that was part of that movie.
Yeah, that Spitfire right there was the first one the CAF bought. It was their own. We've owned a couple of them over the years. Not all of them were ours. A couple of them were on loan, kind of from other people. That particular one was bought in England, was used in the movie, and then in 1969, that Spitfire and then the 4 Messerschmitts that we bought all came back to the U.S. finally, and that one was restored right off the bat, and it has kind of a colorful early CF history, in that a guy named, last name of Smith here in Dallas, sponsored it. And when he sponsored it, he actually paid for the airplane in England, but the title was with the CAF. And so the agreement was, whenever CF had the money, they'd pay him back, or within a certain amount of time, the CF didn't pay him back, he got the title. Well, he got mad, I guess is the easiest way to say it, and he decided that they owed him the airplane, and he had it up here in Dallas, and I forgot which little airport, in his hangar, and it was stripped down, bare metal and everything like that, but still basically together. And the CF had to sue him. They had to go into a lawsuit in 1969 and 1970 to get him to give back the airplane. And what ended up happening is they went to his hangar when he was told to give it back. They went to his hangar, and he had a RV and a bunch of campers and boats and everything else all parked in front of the hangar door where they couldn't get it out. So they actually took the wall off the back of the hangar. They took the sheet metal off the back of the hangar. They drug the Spitfire out in the dark. I don't know who did this. Early CF members is all I know. I've got the paperwork on it. And they towed it out the back. And they towed him down the street to another hangar and locked it up in there where this Mr. Smith couldn't get a hold of it. And he ended up losing his lawsuit, and he had to pay for damages and all that. Well, the CF, got the airplane repaired, flew it down to Harlingen at this point, and repainted it and all. A guy named Dwayne Egley is the guy who did the restoration work on it. And a guy, his name escapes me at the moment, but Bill Larson, lived in Minnesota. His family was very, very successful, and he became First Lord of the Air Ministry and sponsored 100% of the Spitfire. Well, he made a deal, and I've got all the paperwork on this, where for like $27,000, he was sole sponsor in perpetuity of that airplane, never had to put another penny into it, never had to let anyone else fly it. All he had to do was leave it on display for 6 months out of the year down in Harlingen and make it available for CAF events at the CAF's expense. Well, years went by. The airplane kind of in the early 80s kind of lapsed into semi-unairworthy condition. And they said, hey, you're the sponsor of this, Bill Larson, and we need you to put some more money into it. And he whipped out that contract signed in 1970 that said, I don't know y'all a penny. And Lloyd Nolan got all testy about it, saying we'd have never made such a deal or whatever. But later on, they found the actual copy of the contract CF had, which I've actually got today, that original contract. And the general staff had to come back and eat crow and say, you're right. We did agree. As dumb as that agreement was, we did agree. You never have to put another penny into it. And so he actually had full ownership of the airplane for all practical purposes till about 1985, when Howard Pardue and Jackie Galding actually became sponsors, and Bill Larson gave them permission to put money into it. But up until Bill Larson died in 96 or 97, he was the sole sponsor of that airplane and fought you tooth and nail, whatever you wanted to do. Unfortunately, it was on loan to the Canadian Warplane Heritage up there, I think in 1991 or 92, when their hangar caught on fire. And that Spitfire, sadly, the biggest thing left, because I've got the pictures of the cleanup, the biggest thing left was the landing gear castings and the prop hub. Just happened the engine was out for overhaul, but otherwise the airplane is totally gone. I've got a bunch of the original paperwork and logbooks, but there is landing gear is the only thing left of that airplane.
Wow.
Sadly.
And you mentioned the Spitfire, also the Messerschmitts made it back to Harlingen as well.
Yep, there was 4 109s that came back, and that's one of them. They're still in their Battle of Britain paint. You see the B-26 Marauder over there on the right, and then the Thunderbolt behind it. And that's the same Spitfire, same Messerschmitt. On the other side, you'll see the other Messerschmitt. That airplane was the very first, it was one of the very first 4 airplanes that the CAF painted in military colors. And a guy named Bob Griffin, who became very well known in the CAF later on, Bob Griffin sponsored that airplane and paid to have that painted. And I think at the same time, I think he painted the Mustang, the P-40, and something. There was 4 planes painted for like $9,000 or something like that. And he sponsored all the cost of that. But we had 4 of the Messerschmitts. We only flew 3 of them. One of them we never did fly because it became a parts donor for the others. And 3 of them still exist today. One of them was lost in a fatal accident, unfortunately, in 1987. And the remains were buried out at Harlingen. And the remains were very little remains. It burned up completely. But the other 3 airplanes still exist. And I think they all fly actually today. That one on that number 13 in the background, that one has actually been converted and is a 2-seater over in Germany. It's not the one you can buy rides in England. This is a different one that is now converted to a 2-seater over in Germany. It was actually traded later on for the Fiesler storage that the CAF has today. That Messerschmitt was traded for that storage later on in the mid 80s, I think.
All right. Well, speaking of the place in Harlingen, it is a new home for the CAF, and got some original drawings of what the plans were for the base there at Harlingen.
Yeah, you know, Harlingen was originally an Army airfield, and it was a B-26 Marauder training base, gunnery training base. It had a lot of uses during the war, and most of the military facilities, the base facilities, were still there. In 1966, the CAF dedicated their first the first fighter hangar and museum down there in Mercedes, and they originally planned to build a 50-acre airplane museum out there, and it was going to take a lot of money. And it just so happened that the city of Harlingen was in the process of upgrading their airport and making it into the Harlingen International Airport, and they had all these facilities that were just sitting there empty. And they knew by 1967, they're like, hey, the CAF is a big draw down here in the valley. They're very popular, and their air shows are getting great and all that. We need to get them to come here. And so they gave the CAF this entire facility that you see. That hangar 1 there, that building number 1, that became the bomber hangar later on. And the building in the back, number 2, that became the officers club and the original officers club, and then became the offices and the museum and all that, and the PX, all that was in there. But that bomber hangar today, all that stuff is gone now except that hangar right there. It's still there, and it's a DHL hangar today. The rest of the footprint of what was the CAF is now gone. And this is the view of the same thing from the back. I think the runway was like 6,300 feet long compared to the runway in Mercedes. It was 2,600 feet or something like that. So they could operate everything they had off of that spot. And it was a good home up until we moved to Midland. Harlingen was a great place to be. That is actually the artist rendition of it, but it's pretty true to what actually happened. You see the original bomber hangar that I was talking about a minute ago. Across from that, they put up those other 2 hangars, and the one that's open on the end that's really long, that was nearly a direct copy of the building they built over in Mercedes, and that was called the fighter hangar. And if you came there during the air show, that's where all the booths and everything were set up, was in that hangar. And then over to the left of that with the open door was the original maintenance hangar. And that back in those days was an absolute treasure trove. All the spare parts that the CAF had were all stored in that hangar. A lot were in the bomber hangar, but the majority of that little hangar was storage. There was a fuselage to one of the spare fuselages to the CAF's in-model Thunderbolt. There was the fuselage to a Mosquito laying on its side inside the building. In the back, there was a center section. There was engines stacked everywhere. It was glorious. Well, this picture here is around that same time. This picture had to have been taken there in 1969 because you see the P-40 Warhawk there is second from the right. Or I'm sorry, second from the left. It's still painted red, and we got that in 1969. You see in the background the B-47 Stratojet, the C-119, and then I think the F-89 Scorpion. Those were some of the first static displays that the Air Force gave us, and that was, we had this 40-acre ramp out here to use, and so we started filling that up with statics. A lot of people like to say that when the CAF moved away from Harlingen, that all those statics were scrapped, and that's simply not true. None of them were scrapped except for this picture you see on the static ramp there in the very front row. You'll see that C-54 there. The C-54 was scrapped, but it was always planned to be scrapped because it was so corroded. The nose of that is on display in Midland today and was in the museum there in Midland for years and years. But all those airplanes were disassembled and taken out and moved. That C-124 and that C-97 and that C-119, all 3 left in the C-5 Galaxy and went to Warner Robins Air Base. That B-47 is down at Tinker Air Force Base today. Every airplane on that ramp was carried out and put on static display somewhere else except the C-54. This picture was taken after 1972, and you can tell because all the fighters and bombers are on the ramp were all painted in military colors. And Fifi arrived in 1971, and flew again in 1974. Well, you can tell there's no big A on the tail fin. That big A was put on the tail fin in 1975. And so that picture was taken before the airplane flew again in 1974. So somewhere between 72 and 74 based off of that. And that's during one of the air shows. You see a C-130 parked out there on the static ramp. But that's during one of the early air shows there in Midland, in Harlingen, probably 1969, maybe 1970. You can see all the cars parked out there and everything like that. It was a great place, and all the tour birds lined up on the ramp out there and everything like that. It was a great place to have air shows. It was really a wonderful place to go back then. That picture is one of my all-time favorite CAF pictures, and this actually was turned into a postcard and a poster that was sold in the PX there in Harlingen. And you see the red P40 directly behind the red P40. You'll see a zero. That's an AT6 converted into a zero. That was donated to the CF in 1967, and it already had the 3-bladed prop and the geared 1340 on it. That was one of the very first T6s ever converted to a zero with anything more than just a paint job. And it was the inspiration for the airplanes that were converted for the movie Tora. I think this airplane is still around today, but that was the first zero the CF had, and it was a couple of years before Tora was even done. But you see the Marauder in that picture. You see 2 of the Messerschmitts, the Corsair, the B-17, the Mustang, the Hellcat. That's the first Hellcat. And then White Lightning, the P-38, and the B-24. So you see they're all in some form of early CF airplane markings, except for the Battle of Britain airplanes. And they're still in their movie paint. The Spitfire, that's A1A, is the markings on it. That's what it was in the movie. One of the markings. It carried about 6 different markings. And that's a different angle of kind of the same one. This picture had to have been taken in 1969 or later, because the P-82 twin Mustang is sitting there on the ramp. And the P-82, it was donated to the CF, regardless of what the Air Force said 30 years later. It was donated to the CF, and they had 4 letters from chiefs of staff of the Air Force saying that it was donated, and the Air Force had no interest in it. I digress. It had finally arrived in Harlingen in 1969. A guy named Joe Allegrante he was a CF member, and he had a couple of thousand hours in P-82s. There'd been a test pilot on them for the Air Force. He ferried it from San Antonio. One of the interesting things about this airplane, this particular P-82, is it's set on display at Kelly Air Force Base on static display. Well, if you know Kelly Air Force Base and Lackland Air Force Base in San Antonio, they're only separated by the runway. I mean, there's roads that go back and forth and all that. So at the time, there was 2 P-82s on static display. They picked this one because it was in better shape. The one that is on static display today at San Antonio, they left behind. The propellers on the airplane in this picture, they took off of the static P-82 because they were better shape, so they swapped them out. The CF got the P-82, flew it for several years. It had an accident in 1987 or 88. They never could find those propellers again, so they had some plastic propellers made that are just basically P-51 props. So you're supposed to have counter-rotating propellers on the P-82. Well, when it was just sitting static in Midland, we had the plastic props, so they both spun the same direction. When the Air Force took this airplane back, they went back to San Antonio, took the props off of the static display, put the plastic propellers we made that are wrong onto the static display, and today, sitting in the Air Force Museum, this P-82 taken by the Air Force is back in there with the original props that the CF took off in 1966. So very long drawn out for that airplane to wind up with some of its original parts back on. But it would have been in better hands with us, personal opinion.
Oh, I agree.
That's the C-97 that wound up on static display. This is when it first arrived in Harlingen. I think this was 1969. You see everybody down there wearing their grays with the original back patch and everything like that with the flag, and it says Confederate Air Force and then Ghost Squadron underneath there. There's 2 or 3 different versions of that back patch. But that C-97 flew in and was on static display up until the CF moved. And like I said earlier, it was carried out in the C-5 in parts, and it is now on display at Warner Robins Air Base. Most people go down to Warner Robins that are CF people. They don't realize that about 7 of those airplanes on display there, they've seen before down at Harlingen when they were on display down there.
We alluded to the paint schemes of the aircraft, and before the official combat paint schemes were put back on the airplane, they all carried sort of a uniform red, white, and blue paint scheme that really identified the Confederate Air Force.
Right, and that I think that kind of came about because when all these airplanes arrived at Midland or at Mercedes, they were all in different colors. Some were bare metal, some were Like the Hellcat, when it showed up, it still had most Navy markings on there, but like the stars and bars had been spray painted out. They had N numbers spray painted on them. And my suspicion is that the white paint was because it was cheap. White paint was readily available and was probably cheap, and it's probably why they painted the airplanes that color. The red and blue, I think, came along just with the patriotic feel, the red, white, and blue, and maybe even because the Thunderbirds, you know, the Air Force Thunderbirds were red, white, and blue. But the CAF, this made them very distinctive. And like I told them in the last webinar we did, their original air show act was called the Magnolia Blossoms, and they were all painted the same, this red, white, and blue, so everybody knew they were all part of this one team. But that kind of became the house colors of the CAF for several years. And there were different variations. No two were exactly alike, and some looked better than others. The Thunderbolt never really looked good in red, white, and blue because it was such a big airplane. It had so much white on it and very little red and blue because it was just such a big airplane. I mean, even Texas Raiders was painted in these colors. And it wasn't until around 1969 that we painted the very first airplanes into military colors. This is the 191 Hotel. This is the P-63 that the Dixie Wing has today that has test painted on the nose. This is it. This is the second P-63 the CF ever owned. We've actually owned about 4 of them over the years. And one of them was just a project that we never finished. It's out in Bob Pond's museum out in Palm Springs today. Pretty Polly was a CAF P-63 project that we sold to Bob Pond in a roundabout way, and then they restored it on their own. But Tumbleweed still exists today, and it's out at the Dixie Wing. I kind of like that paint scheme. That's Red Nose, the Mustang that is also down at Dixie Wing, the first airplane the CF had. And in the background is the bright red P-40 that we got from Mike Dillon. That's the P-40 that we still have today, that Taylor Stevenson and several other guys from the Mike Anderson, several guys from the P-40 sponsor group. That's the P-40 they fly today, which just debuted its new camouflage paint scheme in Tex Hills colors, which really is gorgeous. That's the Corsair that Dixie Wing has, that one also. It looked really good in the red, white, and blue. And Harry Suzanne was an early CF member. He passed away last year, I guess it was, over in Odessa. Harry Suzanne used to do an air show routine in that was just unbelievable. I mean, he really knew how to fly that airplane, and it looked really good in the red, white, and blue colors. And that's the first Hellcat. That one, we've owned 2 Hellcats over the years. This one was the first one, and the other Hellcat, which we have today, was never painted in these colors. I think we got it in 1969. This one showed up in 64, and unfortunately had a landing accident and caught on fire after it landed. It had a belly landing and caught on fire and burned up. And a little bit of it survived today. Bill Coombs out in Midland, Bill got the wing that survived, got the wing off of the hill there in Midland and had it on display in the High Sky Wing hangar for several years. Then it wound back up on the hill and it ended up being sold to somebody else. And today the wing, the control stick, 2 or 3 other parts from the interior are all going into an airworthy restoration out in Idaho right now. So parts of that airplane will fly again. And then that's 101, the T6 that I guess the CF's probably had the longest. And this one I think we decided is at Midland. And this is in front of the bomber hangar down there in Harlingen. This is later because it's not painted in red, white, blue colors. This is probably 1970 or 71 when that picture was taken. And then that's not all of these T6s were owned by us. I think 2 of them actually were, one of which still exists today. The other one, I can't remember which is which. One of them caught on fire or something like that. And then the other one, 7872 in the back, it didn't actually belong to us. It was somebody else's that flew on behalf of the CAF. And then I don't know which one that is in the back, but at least one of those still flies with the CAF today. And P-38s. P-38s have a long, drawn-out history with the CAF. You can never really figure out who actually owned what and what actually belonged to the CAF and when. This airplane right here is the one that became Scatterbrained Kid 2. There was 2 different Scatterbrained Kids. Scatterbrained Kid 2 was restored in San Marcos and wound up with the second seat behind it, and it had the Hycon fighter nose on it, or bomber nose on it. It was actually a photo recon nose. And that airplane flew for just a very short amount of time and then had a fuel problem and had a crash landing, and wound up getting sold to other people. Scatterbrained Kid 1, the original Scatterbrained Kid, there on the left, and then Double Trouble, which is on the right, that belonged to Gary Levitz of the Levitz Furniture Stores here in Dallas.
And I believe Brad may have is having a little technical difficulties. Let's give a second or two here to see if it pops back. While we're doing that, there's another. That's a gorgeous picture of the P-38 White Lightning, taken from the Minnesota Wings B-25. And yeah, just got a text from Brad, complete power failure because of a storm. So let's see. Maybe Leah, if you could give him a call and maybe get him on the phone line, we can continue doing the narration here as he goes through some of these slides.
I will call Brad.
Okay. Of all things, Mother Nature takes over. Well, one of the good things is that Brad and I talked about some of these slides before we went on the air tonight, and again, it's the P-38s, White Lightning, and Scatterbrained Kid. Yeah, these are great airplanes that really help put the CAF on the map and to help people kind of get to know who the CAF was. And here's three of them: Scatterbrained Kid, White Lightning, and I believe that's Gary Levitz's at the top of the picture. So you can still see Scatterbrained Kid sort of in a pseudo-military paint scheme, and White Lightning, of course, in the red, white, and blue paint scheme with don't forget the Confederate flag on there as well. Brad had mentioned the P-47 Thunderbolts, and just briefly, here's a quick shot of 5 of the fuselages that came out of South America. There were 6 altogether. It must be quite a sight to have seen those all in the hangar there in Harlingen. A little close up there gives you a kind of a perspective on how large the P-47 is. If you've never actually stood next to one, you don't get a sense of the size just looking sometimes at photographs, but you can see with the mechanic in the foreground there. And there's all 6 as they were back in Harlingen. And if you take a look at the photograph up here, you see the original Tora birds. So this is probably a 1970, 72 vintage photo or so. There's White Lightning again. And then all of these P-47s. And as Brad said, all of them today still are on display or in flying. Some of them are still in flying condition. I know I don't do this justice because Brad has all the good stories, but he also has, if you've ever met Brad, you know that he is a consummate saver of artifacts. And this is one of the great ones that he has, the original telegram to purchase the B-17, which would become Texas Raiders, from Aero Service Corporation in Philadelphia. Aero Service Corporation, if you're familiar with the B-17 history, they operated quite a few B-17s as cargo and insect and sprayers especially in the southeast, but they sold a number of B-17s off from their fleet as they became obsolete. The first one that kind of entered the Warbird world as a B-17 used exclusively as a flying museum was Texas Raiders, and that was in 1967. You can see it there again in the original sort of red, white, and blue paint scheme, and then here flying with the sister ship, the B-24 Diamond Lil. So those 2 aircraft, of course, before the extensive restoration on the B-17, you can see it's been stripped of all the turrets, all the waist gun compartment. The windows are gone. You can still see the radio hatch up at the top, but it had been converted, and it would take many years for the for the CAF to bring it back to its original condition. Kevin Michaels does a great webinar that we had several months ago talking about the history of Texas Raiders. Check that out on the YouTube channel, and you can see and understand more of what it took to bring that airplane back to life. And I hear some noise. Is that Brad? Are you back with us?
I'm back. We had lightning hit a transformer, and the entire neighborhood is black. So,
well, goodness. So
everything. Yeah.
I've just been making up stories as we go along here. Talked a little bit about we were showing folks the telegram that you had about Texas Raiders and the sale.
Yeah, the airplane was being used up in Pennsylvania as an aerial survey and photography airplane. And the CF had wanted a B-17 for a long time, obviously, because it was one of the most well-known bombers of the war. And they had negotiated with the city of Abilene here in Texas. There was a B-17 on display at the airport, and they tried to get that one. And then they had an agreement basically in place to do it. And then the city council found out or whatever, and somebody got mad. So that didn't happen. And that airplane is still on static display at Dyess Air Force Base today. So the CF went looking elsewhere, and they found the airplane that became Texas Raiders. And so they bought that in 1967. And they did it by forming a squadron. They got, everybody 100 people to chip in $350 a piece in order to pay for the airplane and pay for its upkeep. And that's kind of how the, sponsorships were always around, but that was really the first squadron that was really formed in order to purchase an airplane and operate it.
All right. We've got another picture of the P-82. This is looks probably when it was just on arrival. You can see all the patches on the skin. And then one of my favorite pictures that you've shared is the P-38 and the P-82 together in flight.
Yeah, that's Joe Allegrante, I believe, in the P-82. And then he's the guy I was talking about earlier that was the test pilot. And then that's Lefty in the P-38, and that was when it arrived in Harlingen and in 1969. And I can't remember who took that picture, but it was taken out of the tail of the B-25 that came down from Minnesota. It wasn't the one that the Minnesota wing has today, Miss Mitchell. It wasn't that one, but it was another one that was operated up there at the time. So that's a pretty well-known picture. It was in a lot of CF literature and stuff, and a lot of brochures and things in the 70s and 80s. Of course, the airplane was later painted black and painted its night fighter colors. It really looked good.
Looking now at the original, I believe this is the Marauder.
The B-26 Marauder. It had been down in Mexico. It had been an executive airplane, and it wound up in Colorado. And it had been repossessed by a bank, and they were about to scrap this airplane just basically for the price of the engines and propellers. And the CAF, they didn't really have the money to buy it, didn't have a squadron for it or nothing like that, but they knew they wanted it. But they also knew if they didn't hurry up and buy it, it was going to get scrapped. And so that's what they did. I think the purchase price was $11,000. They all chipped in and then and bought it, and then Lefty Gardner and Vernon Thorpe went up and picked it up and brought it back down to Harlingen. And it arrived down there and was a flyable airplane, but it had been sitting a long time. It needed a lot of work to keep it going. And they were doing just a random engine run up one day, and the right landing gear collapsed and bent the right wing up, bent the spar and all this kind of stuff. And that started a very long process. That airplane set from about 1970 and finally flew, I think, in 1983 or 84. So it took that many years. They called it the airplane nobody loved. And but they finally got it restored and resparred that wing and everything like that. And unfortunately, the airplane was later lost in a real tragic accident. But for years and years, that was the only flyable Marauder in the world. But that it just happened to arrive nearly in CF house colors. If they'd just thrown some red and blue on there, it would have been.
Well, our next photo is definitely not a Warbird. It is a Breezy, but there's a story behind this as well.
There was a man named Ken Livingston that was down in Harlingen, and he was a master craftsman. He was a woodworker and a metal worker. The guy was just amazing. And he was a CF volunteer. I think he was actually a staff mechanic at one point. But the Breezy was designed by a guy named Carl Unger in Illinois. Him and two other guys built this They wanted to make the simplest home-built airplane you could, not have to put anything else on it that you didn't actually need. And they wound up with what you see there, just an open fuselage. And Ken Livingston built this airplane, painted it in CF house colors. The fuselage is red, the wing was white, and had the blue and red straps on it and everything. And it ended up with Confederate Air Force on the side of it. It ended up with the flag on the tail. And that was called Colonel Culpepper's personal transport. And they flew it. They opened the show with it down there in Harlingen right after the Star Spangled Banner and everything like that. And I don't know whatever happened to the airplane, but it was officially listed as a CAF airplane. And there was a sign that sat in front of it in the hangar that talked about it being Colonel Culpepper's personal transport, and he used it when doing business north of the Smith & Wesson line up in D.C. Whenever he had to go up there, he would take that up there. But it was just kind of a fun little airplane that hung around headquarters for years and years. And I don't know whatever happened to that airplane. I've tried to trace it down, and I've never had any luck doing it.
All right. We mentioned the Mosquito earlier, and we're looking at a picture of it here in front of the hangar at Harlingen.
That airplane is one of several airplanes that the CAF never owned, but everybody thought they did. Because back in the 60s and 70s, and even to the mid-'80s in some respects, the way things worked was people would loan airplanes to the CAF, and they would own them under the financial cover of the CAF, and they paid the operation costs and all that. And that Mosquito is one of those airplanes that was kind of on loan to us, although we never really operated it. But Ed Jurist, the guy who I talked about earlier, being an early CF guy who went around the world gathering airplanes, Ed Jurist found that airplane, bought it in England, and him and another guy, I forgot his name, flew the airplane from England back to Harlingen, and it stayed there for several years until it was finally sold to Dave Talashay out in California. And then it wound up in California, and then it sold back to England, went back to the UK, and then it flew back from the UK one more time. I believe Dave Zuschel flew it back in the 80s. And today, that airplane, sadly, is also on static display in the Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio. But we never actually owned that. But you'll see people say the CF owned the Mosquito, and you'll actually see CF paperwork that says we did. But we didn't ever really own that Mosquito. Would have been nice, though.
The picture now we're looking at is Corsair, and looks like someone filling the gas tank.
That airplane, that's actually Bob Pond's airplane today out in Palm Springs, California. It still exists. The CAF, this is kind of what I was talking about, where there's a lot of planes that weren't really ours, but were flown like they were. And that Corsair was in a lot of early CAF photos after we started painting military planes in military colors. And that one was never actually ours. It belonged to John Stokes a lot of the time down in San Marcos. And John was a big supporter of the CAF, and he did a lot of things with us and flew a lot of his planes in support of us. And so that picture, I just included that in there, one of the planes that people think is ours, but never really was. But it still exists today. Still technically flyable, although it hadn't flown in several years.
All right, and I believe this is the Havoc sitting in the ramp at Harlingen.
The A20 Havoc, we got that originally in 1966. They found it in Boise, Idaho, and did a lot of work to it, bought it for just nearly nothing because it was in really bad shape, sitting out in the weeds. And Lloyd Nolan and Lefty Gardner and Connie Edwards and Vernon Thorpe all went up and looked at it, made a deal for it, and the guy's like, yeah, all the parts are laying around in various hangars. They found the hatch and the missing panels and all that. It was all laying inside. And then Vernon and Lefty and Connie Edwards went back up there, and they flew the thing home. And they flew it back to Brownwood because that was the bomber base at the time. And the story of how they got it back is absolutely hysterical. They like to say that they all were qualified in their single and multi-engine fire day and night flying with that A20 because it lost an engine twice, 2 different times in flight. They restarted it once and lost it again, restarted it again. Then they had an electrical fire on the panel behind the pilot. And then the cockpit filled with smoke after the fire went out. I mean, it was literally a comedy of errors. And then they arrived. There was nobody at Harlingen or at Brownwood on the ground because they were all in the airplanes. And so Connie Edwards was flying a Baron, which was the chase airplane. He landed on the runway using his lights to show Lefty where the runway was so he could land the A20 because it had no lights because of the electrical fire. So the fact that they got the airplane home was amazing. And then they later ferried it over to Harlingen. And the FAA tried to violate Vernon Thorpe on that because it was still on a ferry permit and they hadn't extended it. He ended up not getting violated. But everything about that A20, just getting it to Harlingen was a comedy of errors. It's actually a really good story. The airplane was restored and they flew it for several years until tragically it was lost in an accident with Max Gardner. But it was the way they got it was neat, at least.
There are some interesting stories that go along with a number of our airplanes, both that are in the fleet now and have been in the fleet in the past. And Brad, just a couple of minutes that we have left here. Any other interesting stories that that we haven't gotten to tonight as we kind of went through the mid '60s into the early '70s history of the CAF?
Yeah. Well, if you think about it, you think about the CAF. I've said before in other webinars we did that it kind of started with 2 planes, 10 guys, and a joke. And by 1968, actually the end of 1967, they were up to 322 members. And so from 1957 to 67, they went from 10 guys to 322. And the investment in the airplanes was close to $255,000 at that point. And they had 21 airplanes by then. And you look at the CAF today, several thousand members, who know telling how many millions in investment of the airplanes. But that's in all these years, we've gone from 2 airplanes to 170 airplanes or whatever it is now. I don't remember what the count is now. Well, it did it a little at a time. And finally in the 60s is when they finally broke 20. And then it really started getting out of control after that point. They started just getting airplanes, buying them right and left, and they started expanding the fleet. Their goal was to still have the 10 important fighter planes. And they got that later on. And then they completed their World War II collection in '71 when they got the Helldiver and the Dauntless. That kind of completed the collection. Well, then they got into PBYs and more bombers and everything else. So, but it's kind of funny. In 1957, it was 2 airplanes. 1967, 21 airplanes. And here we are in 2021. It's 170. So it's just grown exponentially. And I still think it's hysterical that something that started out as a joke has been so wildly successful.
Yes. Hey, we've got a couple of questions from the audience tonight. Terry'd like to know, how quiet was it inside Diamond Lil? And I'm assuming this would be before the interior the plush interior was taken out.
I do know that when it was a military airplane, it was converted to a transport. It was still just brutally loud on the inside. I've seen written reports about that. I never flew in the airplane, obviously, when it was in the executive transport, but people that I know that did, they said it was just like a Learjet. When you're sitting inside the airplane, it was so well insulated and everything, you could carry on a conversation with each other just sitting there. So probably about the level of an airliner today. It was a very plush executive airplane, so probably about like an airliner.
Awesome. And let's see, what happened to the B-25 named Chapter 11?
That airplane was never ours. That airplane, I think, is down in Australia today. It wound up setting in Virginia, I believe, after it kind of fell into financial ruin, I guess is the easiest way to say it. And it had a lot of corrosion issues and all that, and it got sold in some kind of auction not too many years ago. And I believe it wound up down in Australia where they say they're going to restore it someday. But it's in pretty bad shape. But that's another one of those planes that was never ours, but was operated with us a lot and had Confederate Air Force written on it because everybody tried to support the mission back then. But that was never one of our airplanes.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks, Brad, for sharing some of your stories and insights with us tonight. And we'll look forward to doing this again in a month or so, about 6 weeks. We kind of look at the 1970s as we continue our history series of the CAF, and certainly hope your power gets back sometime soon so you can enjoy the rest of your evening.
I see across the street all the neighbors are still standing outside, so it's still not on. It's getting hot in the house in a hurry, too.
There you go. You're going to have to go out and stand in the street with everybody else.
I guess so. I got to go be sociable.
There you go. Well, thank you again for joining us for our CAF Warbird Tube webinar. Remember, if you have any suggestions for any future guests or topics you'd like us to cover, just drop Leah Block a note at media@cafhq.org. Again, thanks to Brad Pilgrim, our resident historian, for sharing stories tonight with us. We certainly appreciate you taking time from your busy schedule to be with us as well, and we hope to see you again next Wednesday night, 7 o'clock Central Time. I'm Steve Buss for the Commemorative Air Force.